We called all this stuff grievance studies. That's a very handy term because it's cultural studies that focus on grievance. That's the short reason for why we use that term, and social grievances. A more appropriate term for this approach to doing things would be what we're now calling applied postmodernism, and there are reasons for that. And then what does that really mean? Ultimately, it's a set of fields, methods, and approaches that rely on a lens that's called critical constructivism. So there are two words to that. And when you understand the two words, it's really not as scary an academic term as it sounds. Constructivism is the idea that things are social constructions, that everything's made out of, it's all socially constructed. So your sex, for example, is socially constructed. People tell you what you're supposed to be a woman, and therefore that's what you made yourself. That's the idea of social constructions. So the society and people within it are everything that we have is constructed by the way people are socialized and socialize with one another and the ideologies that are in play. And critical means complaining about power dynamics. And that's not an exaggeration. That is not a caricature. The point of critical in the context that it's meant here, it's not the same critical as you have in critical thinking. It's not the same critical that you have in critical mass. Critical thinking, is like to apply skepticism. Critical mass means there's a sufficient amount to where something, in this case, a nuclear chain reaction happens. In this case, critical means complaining about power dynamics. Critical means to look at the existing systems and structures in society so as to identify the power dynamics and to critically evaluate them so as to make them more visible with the objective of creating political change around them. That's what critical means. So the critical constructivism as grievance studies contains an assumption that is constructivist thought. The constructivist theory is the only way to understand the world, and critical, which is that this interpretive lens or this interpretive approach and political agenda is the only way to properly interpret what's going on.
And you were saying that this
is
essentially what's going on. But you were saying that this is essentially what's going on in grievance studies?
Yes. It's not perfect, but grievance studies and applied postmodernism and critical constructivism are nearly synonyms. Just critical constructivism is the prevailing interpretation or interpretive view and approach that grievance studies uses. Grievance studies is a moniker that we said, okay, you have cultural studies that's focused on social grievances. Boom, grievance studies. And applied postmodernism is actually probably, in my opinion, the best description for what's really going on. It's not as cut to the chase as critical constructivism, but it is more accessible because that's what postmodernism did, is it deconstructed things and tried to do so in a way that was consistent with what's called postmodern critical theory, which some people deny exists, but it doesn't. It does exist, I should say. Those people are wrong. The postmodern approach is to look at society as a system of power dynamics and socializing forces that creates unfairness. And the point of that is to deconstruct those and ultimately to criticize them and to make the structural problems more visible so that they can be politically remedied. Applied postmodernism is how it changed from the Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard. These are the big deconstructionist postmodern philosophers, the French postmodernists who ruined everything, so to say. They just wanted to take things apart and play with ideas and take everything down to its to where nothing makes sense. But in the 80s and 90s, largely you see it a little bit in gender and queer theory, but you also see it very specifically in critical race theory. You started to see this development where scholars realized that if they wanted to make a difference, if they wanted to achieve change, that they had to start admitting that things were real, which the original postmodernists were trying to deconstruct. And so they admitted that oppression based on identity and the power structures in society that create that oppression are real. And now we can apply that postmodern deconstructive and critical theory to make those problems visible and change them. And that's what we see going on. So, I mean, it's a lot of terminology. That's the dorky side of what we did. Dog humping is more accessible.
So how it seems to me that this field of study is expanding. It's becoming more mainstream. Why do you think that is? Why is it catching on so I guess widespread?
I have a not mainstream view of why I think it's starting to become mainstream. And it is. It's mainstreaming pretty rapidly. There's a few things going on. Helen, I'll point out, believes, and I think correctly, that part of what's happening now is that the people who are invested in this view very, very strongly have become overconfident and are showing their hand too early. They think that they have more power and more say than they actually do, and they're showing their tendencies and their true beliefs openly more than they ever have. And they're doing it before it's going to work. And so things are actually shifting back the other direction away from them. And I think that's correct. I think that it started to really blossom. If you want my honest interpretation, during the Obama administration, there's a lot of things geopolitically that were going on leading into that and then through that time. This is a not mainstream view, and I don't really like to get too much into this, but what the hell. So you had the death of neoconservative politics as George Bush's economy collapsed, and the crises with the wars in Iraq and the Middle East. And so you have this distrust of the prevailing political paradigm. You have Obama come in, he's pushing hope and change. You have the failing neoconservatives in Congress, and then being flanked by these angry Tea Party people who decided that the way to go was, in the words of Mitch McConnell, to make Obama a one-term president, basically by doing whatever. What I watched during those 8 years that Obama was president was I watched a lot of people on the left get more and more pissed off that the Republicans were cheating. And if you start, as my studies into the psychology of religion and psychology of authoritarianism go, when you start to feel out of control, you start to act in ways that aren't normal. So one of the things you start looking for is a ready explanation for what's going on and for something you can do about it, to understand and then to exert control. It's all based in a crisis of control. So where you had the hardlining Republicans spending 8 years of resisting everything Obama did, I mean, threatening to shut down the government, shutting down the government, threatening to default on our debt, all these crazy things that were portrayed in the media, whether rightly or wrongly, as being existential crises. And then Obama not being able to achieve the progressive agenda to the degree that many of his supporters thought they would be able to. You saw a crisis of control arise on the left, particularly on the far left, and they searched for an explanation, and critical race theory and critical gender theory were there saying we live in a patriarchal, white supremacist, cis hetero tyranny that is run by a bunch of old white men who want to control the world and oppress people and maintain and press their own power and advantage. And it fit. It was enough of a fit. I don't think it's right, don't get me wrong, but it was enough of a fit for people who were desperate to understand what was going on to latch onto it. And then in 2015, you had these highly publicized shootings of black teenagers by police. Whether those were justified or not is irrelevant to the image that sent to people who were glomming onto this. We live in a racist society where white people want to maintain the control that they're losing. And boom, there it went. The explanation spread like wildfire, and a whole lot of people in utter desperation clung to it. Then what happens in 2016? We elected the freaking avatar of these ideas, and for the people who buy into that theory, confirmed every single one of their worst fears about society. So now they're just absolutely going nuts, and they feel utterly out of control. So they're looking for ways to understand. So they turn to theory and regain control through actions. They turn to activism that's consistent with that theory. I think that's why this has blown up.
Do you think social media has played a role in the spread?
Totally. There's other aspects to it than just that. For example, the ability to network on social media has enabled, if you've read Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning's paper and book about the rise of victimhood culture, for example.
We actually had Bradley Campbell on as well.
Yeah. So then you have the idea. So basically, the internet enables that to a degree that I don't think other information paradigms allow. Social media allows people to find people they agree with. They allows people to be exposed to what seems to be homogenous opinions from people that they like and respect, while getting a steady diet of stuff that freaks them out and radicalizes them from people that they hate, whether that's people that are being hate shared or they're finding out that their neighbor has these crazy, awful, regressive views or terrible progressive ideas and they're, whatever. And everybody starts hating each other. So social media definitely has created the environment in which this could happen and poured continuous copious amounts of like jet fuel on it so that it would burn hotter and angrier than ever. So certainly social media has played a role. I don't think it's as simplistic as to say, oh, well, social media happened, therefore all this stuff crapped out. I think that there were other forces that go on in addition to that. But I'll admit that, I did spend a lot of time reading about the psychology of control. And so I do see it maybe more brightly than is warranted.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.